Now, for more perspective on China's population census, let's bring in Dan McClory. He's Managing Director and Head of China at Boustead Securities. Always good to have you on, Dan.
Thanks, Rachelle.
So first off, start by telling us, how does China's census work and why is it so important?
Well, not unlike the U.S., every 10 years it takes place. There are quite a number of, I'll call them foot soldiers, about 7 million census takers that actually go door to door in a lot of cases. Tencent actually cooperated with an app that was used to automate and streamline some of the data collection. And it's pulled in very similar ways: marital status, number of people in the household, where they are originally from in China, their ethnicity within China, and a variety of factors. So it's something that happens every 10 years, but make no mistake, China, like other industrialized nations, keeps track every year and in other ways, and has been closely monitoring the population trends for at least a couple of decades now.
And usually with censuses, there is a little bit of hesitation. People can be concerned about privacy. How has China gone about addressing that?
Well, I think one of the ways was by involving Tencent. So they're taking a company that's produced many apps that are in very pervasive use throughout China that a lot of the population is familiar with, and so they're using that as kind of a bridge to help collect data. In some cases, a lot of data that these third parties already have. So rather than coming at someone with an unfamiliar, perhaps government-mandated means, they're reaching out through a familiar app developer in Tencent.
So let's look at the data itself then. What were the key takeaways from China's census report?
Well, I mean, it's clear that population growth has all but stopped. I mean, it is extremely very slow pace. But I think some of the points that we heard in the prior piece that have to do with they called it psychological, but kids in China just don't want to have children. You can say they're selfish. You can say it's the transition to a consumer economy. You can say it's massive levels of debt. Relative to having almost no debt maybe a decade or a decade and a half ago. But the bottom line is all those are acting as the most effective contraceptives for having children and not some government policy. Polls have been taken to say, what if they change the policy to having 2, 3, 4, 5 kids? How many takers would there be? About half said, we don't want to have any kids. So I really think it's now turned into preferences and certainly an emphasis on self and me, and it's inconvenient and expensive to have children.
So then, in terms of diversity within China's population, were there any surprises or trends you noticed?
Well, you know what they say, Rachelle? I mean, and this has to do with any industrialized country in the world. You better get rich before you get old, okay? Because if not, you're going to have these imbalances and, funding Social Security for the new workers that are funding it, and for the people that are coming off it, you're going to have big problems. The good news with China is economic prosperity is indisputable, and it has occurred for 25 plus years. So there's nice momentum that's been built into this. So it's actually somewhat unusual to see a country that's hitting its stride economically and in independent ways, like through a consumer-driven economy and not just manufacturing, to be tackling these challenges. You would expect it in places like Europe, where growth has either declined or is just not as prevalent. But it's a little bit shocking, it's a little bit alarming in China. So I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that despite the prosperity, despite the alleviation of poverty, despite the move from rural to urban settings, we're now seeing this imbalance. And many could turn those words around that I just uttered and say it's because of all those things, Dan. It's more expensive to have kids in cities. The more money people have, the more they want to spend, the less they want to care about bringing up children. But I think those are some of the important takeaways. Most outsiders will look at China and say, well, it's the one-child policy. Of course, that's why we've ended up the way they are. No, it's far more complex than that.
Right. So then, as you look at this latest census information, what does this mean then for government investment in, say, infrastructure, social welfare, education, etc.? And how does that line up with the 14th five-year plan? Right.
Well, I think first and foremost, the government has to decide that even if incentivized, would couples opt to have children? And as I mentioned, in some of the polling that's taken place where they've just said, hey, if there were no limits, how many would you have? You know, half said they didn't want to have any. So I think the starting point is the mindset and the culture of either not having children or being used to there only being one. And that's something that's more complex to address than any government policy, but clearly, things like subsidized daycare, things like equal treatment of female workers, male workers having maternity and paternity leaves, things that you see in Europe and to some extent in the US, clearly those would be a step of encouragement. Whether they're going to change this decline or this stunted growth remains to be seen. But I think those are some ways where China, in encouraging this rural to urban migration, encouraging the growth of megacities, which have more opportunities but are more expensive,
right,
they can also add some benefits.
All right, well, thank you so much. Always good to get your insights. Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China at Boustead Securities.